There's something that happens this time of year, to some of us, to me, surrounded by sights and sounds that tell me to celebrate. It's the most wonderful time of year, but in my heart, it's just winter. It's like the isolation you feel when you're playing hide and seek, and no one ever finds you, and you're not even sure if they're still looking. I long for God. I long to know what it's like to feel His presence, to feel joy, to feel hope. But what if this path is more than how I feel? What if it's not about being forgotten, but it's about being found? What if the way back to joy and hope is actually seeking me out? What if it's closer than I think?
We're going to read this morning from Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 38. Luke chapter 1, verses 26 to 38. Would you join me in standing as we read the word of the Lord? In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored, the Lord is with you." Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. But the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end." "How will this be?" Mary asked the angel, "since I am a virgin?" The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you, so the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she, who was said to be unable to conceive, is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail." "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word to me be fulfilled." Then the angel left her. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. It is all happening. It is busy, and God is at work, and it is crazy. First of all, Elizabeth, in her old age, thinking that she was barren, is being told that she will have a child. Her priest husband, who receives this news, doubts it and is thus made silent. Can you hear the echoes of Abraham and Sarah in the story? God is not done. God sends an angel also to Mary, a young woman, 13, 14, 15 years old, betrothed to be married, not yet married, her whole life and future in front of her. And when this angel makes its way to Mary, Mary, we're told, is startled. And I was kind of caught by that a little bit. Why would Mary be startled? Wouldn't you recognize what an angel is? It's got a little halo. It's white, pretty wings. Seems like if an angel shows up, this would be good news, right? An angel is a herald, a messenger of God. God's message would surely be good news, right? Why is she nervous? Why is she startled? And then I got to thinking, maybe that image of the angel on top of our Christmas tree isn't always what an angel looks like. So I started thinking of other images in the Bible of angels. When humans see angels, what does it look like? And I began to think of Revelation chapter 10. Revelation chapter 10, John tells us in pretty vivid description what an angel that he sees looks like. And if you've ever read Revelation and tried to really think about what this looks like, it's often very terrifying, and it's also very hard to draw. And so I found a piece of art on Revelation 10's angel. Check this out. It looks like the cover of a metal album, right? And this is, if you were to read Revelation 10 and see, this is a pretty good effort at what it is John is describing as an angel. It says, the face shined like the sun with a rainbow around its head, and its legs were like stalks of fire. That's pretty good. And so, I don't know what angel showed up to Mary, but if it was this angel, I can appreciate why she is startled. And the message she gets is one that is not startling, it seems. Greetings, you are highly favored, the Lord is with you. Great. Thank you. Unfortunately for Mary, the message didn't end there. It's one thing to know that you're favored by God. That is great. But now that she is favored by God, God has a big ask for her. A big request. God is not asking for something simple today, like to put $5 in the offering plate. God's request of her is this: will you conceive and bear my child? What? I thought you said I was favored, God. If I was favored, why would you ask this of me? You would think when God shows up and asks something of us, so often we receive these requests as a burden. I am burdened by what you are asking of me, God. But here Mary is told that she is favored. She is not being asked of something just to burden her. It is her being favored that necessitates or predates the call. She is called because she is favored. And so often when we think about God calling and asking for something of us, we don't think of ourselves as favored when we receive this call. We think of ourselves as burdened. Now I have to do something. Mary, sure enough, had to do something. And what she had to do is difficult, not only because of all of the implications, we'll get to that in a second, but God was asking her to do something that was actually quite impossible. She could not just will her body to become pregnant. And she was, as the text tells us, a virgin, not yet married. So how would she become pregnant? The angel reminds her, well, Elizabeth, your relative, also shouldn't be able to become pregnant. But she is. Nothing is impossible with God. And Mary gives herself up to God's impossible. And it's so amazing that God chooses to act in this way. Why in the world would God act by reaching out to a teenage girl, asking her to participate in his grand plans? If God is as powerful as we think God is, there are so many ways that God could have accomplished his goal of sending his son into the world. He could have lit up the sky with wonders. He could have tore the heavens open and dropped Jesus onto earth. He could have given us a 30-year-old man that came from nowhere, suddenly walking around. He could have found a queen, a woman with power and wealth, to be his surrogate. Instead, God chooses a common young woman, a virgin with everything to lose and seemingly nothing to gain. And he calls this nobody favored. When God calls on us, do we feel favored or do we feel burdened? When God calls on us and asks us for a next step in our life or a yes from us, how often do we bust out the laundry list of reasons that we can't? Oh, not me, God. I'm too sinful. I'm too busy. I'm too embarrassed. I'm not good enough. Surely there is someone better than me that you can find. I have too much to lose. I have so little to gain. Maybe when the time is right in my life. Maybe when I'm just a little more settled. Maybe when I'm a little more financially viable. I don't know if you're like me, but I've used most of those excuses before when God has called upon me. And when God calls us to something, too often we act as if we lost the lottery. As if we had big expectations that when God says, "You are my favored one," we think what's coming next is a big prize. But not for Mary, and so often not with us. When God shows up and calls us favored, So often, there's an ask that comes after it. It's no different with Mary. Same situation, an angel comes. God's call comes upon her life, and she has so many reasons to say no. She's unmarried. Her saying yes and then announcing this to her family and friends would not include pink or blue cakes in an Instagram-worthy video. Instead, it would bring upon her quiet shame in her community for the rest of her life. I imagine she wondered if she would just be a surrogate or the actual mother of this baby. What would Joseph think? Was there any way that he would believe that she had been faithful against overwhelming evidence to the contrary? Would this cost her her marriage? Would this be a scarlet letter that would cost her any marriage? Is carrying and birthing God harder than carrying and birthing a naturally conceived child? What will my parents think? What will my neighbors think? All of these questions would have been super legitimate. And she weighs the cost of God's call in her life. And in spite of the troubling and unsettling potential cost, she says yes. And she doesn't only say yes, but she says, "May your word to me be fulfilled." As much as was asked of her, she wanted God's word to be fulfilled in this world. And if it cost her something, so be it. It seems that as terrifying as the angel was and as big as the ask is, she believed that it was because God had favor on her that she was being asked such big things. You see, sometimes in our own mind we expect that when God has favor in us, he's going to give us things. But in Mary's equation, she was asked of big things because God had favor on her, not the other way around. So I ask you, what is God calling you to do? What is the call that God has placed upon your life? What is God's big ask that you're wrestling with in this season? And my guess is it's not big or revolutionary or terrifying as being the bearer of God's Son. But is God asking you to join or start a small group? Is God asking you to forgive a friend, a spouse, a parent, a child? Is God asking you to start giving more, start giving it all to the church or to a ministry outside of the church that's doing good in the sake of the world? Is God asking you to pursue a call to ministry? Is God asking you to start a ministry within the church? What is God asking of you in this season, in this moment? What is his call that he's placing on your life? And we must remind ourselves as we wrestle with this and think about this and ask what God is doing amongst us, that if there's anything we can learn about the story of Mary, it is that God asks big things of the people who he has favor on. We do not have to receive the call that God is placing on our life as a burden, another difficult thing. We don't have to shake our fist at heaven and say, "Why do you ask me to carry this heavy burden?" God asks you to participate in his work to bring salvation to this world because you are the favored one of God. It is his favor that causes us to be his called. He has a plan to redeem and to save the entire world. This is God's core activity. And when he calls us to do something in partnership with him, it is because we are his favored children. He's inviting us to be an insider in God's scandalous plan to redeem a sinful and fallen world. We are his co-conspirator. We are his partner. We are his co-worker. We are his favored. And sometimes the work that he calls us to is difficult and the cost is heavy in terms of the way the world sees how things go. But so often the payoff is so profound and so exciting. And so often when we look back on the difficult things we have been called for in our life, we see it on the other side as all blessing, even though we saw it on the front end as terrifying and costly. You see, I know in my own life, there's been times that God has called me and asked me to do something, and it seemed so deeply costly at the time. And yet I look back upon these things and I think, it's brought me more joy than it has pain or cost. Not that things are always easy when God calls, but so often it fulfills a part of you that you didn't even know you needed fulfilled. Take, for example, my call to ministry. I had no plans to be a pastor. It hadn't even occurred to me. Really, I grew up in a poor family. My dad was an enlisted military man, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. We had no money, so my whole goal as a child was to research which jobs paid big and get one so that I could be rich and not poor. This was my goal with my life. And so finally I decided that I was pretty good at arguing, so I should be a lawyer. They make big money, and I would go sometimes to downtown Boston with my dad when I was a kid, and I would see these guys walking around in dark, really expensive-looking suits, and I had no idea what they did, but I wanted to be like them because they were wealthy. They had money, I could tell. And so my whole life was trying to figure out how to make money. And I thought I'd had my whole life settled with God. I'd given my life to Him. I was going to follow Him no matter what. I was going to be a part of the church. I was going to love God with all my heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then the rest of my life was going to be dedicated to making money. I saw no problem with this. And so it all came to a head. It was after my sophomore year in high school. I was at a teen camp. And see, since I had everything sorted with God, I was there to do the only thing left, and that was to hang out with cute girls. And I was really excited on the last day of camp that year. All these other teens were trying to figure out how they could take their experience with God back to their life, but I was already a Christian. And so on the last day, we had this communion service on a Friday morning, which was great. I like communion, right? And I was sitting next to the girl that I thought was the cutest. My life couldn't have been better. Everything was figured out. And just as soon as the preacher got up there and started preaching, I had this I don't want to make it seem like it was real weird, but this almost out-of-body experience where I lost awareness of people around me. It's not like I was transported to anything, but I kind of lost awareness of the room, and it was as if God was speaking just to me, as if I was the only person in the room. I couldn't hear what the preacher was saying. I was no longer aware of the cute girl sitting next to me. But God was very clear with me that I was to give up my hopes and dreams and instead follow Him into pastoral ministry. This was against everything I wanted with my life. Because if there was anything I had heard preachers preach about, left, right, up, and down growing up, was that they didn't make any money. That pastors were poor. And that giving yourself to a life of ministry was giving yourself to a life of poverty. I was not impressed with the life of pastoral ministry, precisely because of this. I knew that when God called me, I had to give up my dreams of becoming wealthy. And for some reasons that I can't articulate to you today, except that I felt like God was talking to me, I said yes. I gave up my dreams for what my life would look like. And that was the big yes, but there's been little yeses, one after another since then. Sharice and I going to college and then committing to go to seminary afterwards when that wasn't our plan. Starting to give more money to the church because the church needed it, even though we didn't have any whatsoever. Starting small groups when our time was limited. I felt a call by God to start coaching in the high school so I can get nearer and closer to the teens and get to know families in the community. And we had a little baby and absolutely no time or extra energy to spend. All of these things are huge blessings in my life now, but the cost felt immense at the time. Giving up my ambitions, giving up my time with my family, giving up our money, which we didn't have, one after another saying yes to God, all became blessings when the cost felt heavy in the moment. Sometimes our little yeses and our big yeses are just the questions that God gives us because He wants to show us and make His favor known to us. And our yes may feel like a burden, but so often it becomes blessings that define our life. I tell you my story, but my goodness, there are stories all around us in our church as well. 2020 has been so difficult because I have so much less face time with people. And yet, with all of the loss of face time, I'm still hearing these stories of God doing incredible work amongst us and people in our church's life. I just made a list of things that have happened in just the last few weeks of people saying yes to God's call on their life. For example, there's a middle-aged man in our congregation who came and told me that he was done running from God's call, which has been on his life his whole life. And in his middle age, he got his local license from our church and has started classes to begin ministering as a minister in the church. There's a professional who's laying the groundwork in their life right now to quit their job so that they can enter ministry full-time. We have 5 people in our congregation who are going to MAC weekend, which is the first step towards getting a district license towards ordination. 5 people. I sat with a family recently who was planning for a funeral, and as I was trying to help them process their grief, they couldn't help but talk about God's goodness in their life and how much love they have experienced of God through the trial of watching their loved one die over a process of years. We have a few families who gave me a call and asked how they could donate at the end of the year to the church to make sure that people are taken care of, to make sure that our funds are taken care of. And they wanted to give over and above what they normally do and wanted to make sure that they gave appropriately. There's a young man in our congregation who lost his job. And he told me that while he was terrified when he lost his job, he's found that this season has allowed him to recalibrate all of his priorities. He and his wife have begun taking Sabbath together and finding that rest has rejuvenated them. He found new time to lean into with his young family and his kids. And he's found a new love for them. And he's found that his family matters more than his career and his work. And he'd never experienced that before. And now after finding these gifts that were right in front of him, he suddenly had 4 or 5 different job opportunities and interviews in just the last couple of weeks. These stories are just stories of people in our congregation from the last couple of weeks reaching out and talking to me. There are other things this year that have been astounding to me as well. We've had 2 pastors, Jake and Austin, receive the call from our church and moved here in the middle of a global pandemic, not being able to get out and experience the neighborhood or really understand what it's like, still finding that there are people in the congregation that they've not met. And they said yes to God, and our church is richer for it. We had a family all the way back in the beginning of the pandemic who called me up. They got their government stimulus check and decided that they didn't need it. They still had their job in place. And they were more concerned about the fact that there are people in our congregation that were going to go without, that were losing their job. And so they wrote over the entire check to our benevolence fund to make sure that there were people in our congregation that were fed and were helped if they were needy. In the middle of the summer, we raised $30,000 by asking to help recreate our technology in our congregation so that we could be providing great worship experiences to people in their houses, and then also leveraging that as an opportunity to reach out as make that a front door to people so that people can feel comfortable getting to know our church before they risk coming here. Unbelievable thing to do when the economy feels like it's in recession and slowed and people are losing their jobs. People opened up their checkbook to help fill a strategy for the sake of our church. These are all things that God is doing among people, helping people say yes, calling them in the midst of a difficult and strange year. And each and every one of them, in saying yes, is finding that God is supplying everything they need in order to keep saying yes. God is at work in our midst, helping people say yes to what He has for them. Like Mary, God calls us to hard things. Sometimes the things God calls us to are incredibly difficult things. But He doesn't call us to burden us. He doesn't call us to test us. He doesn't call us to make our life difficult. He calls us because we are favored, because we are His loved children, and He wants to see us thrive in His kingdom. We get to see a mighty power of God, a mighty work of God happen in and through us in the world for the sake of the world. So what is your next yes to God? What is God asking you to give or to do that you're wrestling between a yes and a no? You are God's next step in his plan of unveiling his love and his salvation and redemption for the world. Your saying yes is going to be transformative to someone around you. And you may not know who that person is yet, but through you, God's power may be seen to someone who desperately needs to see it. Mary's yes brought Jesus into human form. Emmanuel became fully formed and a reality amongst us. God is with us because Mary said yes. Your next step, your yes, may be writing a check or making a phone call or starting a devotional routine or plan or joining a small group or starting a small group or entering the ministry or welcoming someone back into your family or into your home or going over to a senior adult and spending time with them or bringing them to an appointment. God's call may be big or God's call may be small, but God is calling. And God is not calling so as to inconvenience you or to make your life difficult or to test you. God is calling because you are his favored child. You get to participate from the inside of God's plan to save the world. The next steps in faith that God is asking you to take are about experiencing God's love and then passing it on. Those of you who have been around here for a while know that just about a year ago, my mom died, and we had her funeral right here in this room. Right at last Thanksgiving, actually. And my mom was a product of the hippie generation. She graduated high school in 1973, started high school right after Woodstock in 1969. My mom found faith in a little Methodist community in northern Massachusetts. That church welcomed her in and showed her love that she'd never experienced before. She found faith there. Her family was irreligious, but because the church opened their doors to her and welcomed her and loved her in spite of her poverty and in spite of her baggage of being abused as a child, her life was transformed because she found Jesus because of people who said yes to him. And so in this era of hippie Christianity that she came to faith in, she would tell stories about gathering around a fire and singing songs, little chorus songs together. And one of the ones that she used to sing to me that carried on from those years, when I was just a little child, we had sung at her funeral last year. Dave Lowe sang it, and that cracked me up because Dave told me this was the song he told God he'd never sing before. He'd never sing again. But he did it because it was asked for a funeral. And Dave to this day will tell you, don't tell God what you won't do. He'll keep asking, right? But this song is such a great way, I think, to close out our Advent season, especially on this day of love. And the song reminds me that our simple yes to God sometimes is what will break out a spirit of revival, God's love pouring out of us because of a simple act of saying yes to God. The little chorus goes just like this. It only takes a spark to get a fire going, and soon all those around can warm up with its glowing. That's how it is with God's love. Once you've experienced it, you spread his love to everyone you want to pass it on. Open up your heart to God's call. Say yes to his love. He calls you because he loves you. And when you see that he loves you and he's calling you out of his love, your yes passes on that love of God to the rest of the world. Would you join me in standing as we sing about God's extravagant love as we close out this service?